Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shruti Jargar, and I'm a research assistant at ICS. On behalf of the Institute of Chinese Studies, I welcome you all to this edition of Wednesday seminar. The topic under discussion today is emerging strategic contestation in the South Pacific. We have a panel of eminent speakers amidst us. Ambassador Yogendra Kumar is a retired diplomat and has recently authored the books Diplomatic Dimension of Maritime Challenges for India in the 21st Century, Whither Indian Ocean Maritime Order, and a third one, the link to which can be found in the chat box. Vice Admiral Anil Chopra is a former Commander-in-Chief of the Western Naval Command and the Eastern Naval Command, as well as a former Director General of the Indian Coast Guard. He is currently associated with multiple think tanks in distinguished positions. Our final speaker, Dr. Pragya Pandey, is a research fellow at the Indian Council of World Affairs, Sapru House, where she works on issues related to maritime security, Indian Ocean, Indo-Pacific, and regional geopolitics. Joining us as chair today is Ambassador Biren Nanda, who's a distinguished former career diplomat with extensive experience of working in East Asia. Ambassador Nanda also serves as a senior fellow at the Delhi Policy Group. A very warm welcome to all the panelists. Before I hand over to the chair, I request the audience to note the housekeeping rules. All participants shall stay muted during the presentations. Questions can be posed in the chat box anytime during the event or using the raise hand option during the Q&A session. Kindly unmute yourself only when called upon by the chair to do so. Thank you. Now I request the chair to carry forward the proceedings. Over to you, sir.
Yeah. Since we are running on a very tight schedule, I'll go straight to my opening remarks. Then we'll follow with the presentations by the panel and go into and have a general discussion after that. Australia, New Zealand, and the United States, and to a lesser extent, UK, EU, and Japan are key partners of Pacific Island countries, which comprise of 14 independent and semi-independent states. Pacific countries share similar challenges, such as small populations, limited resources, vulnerability to rising sea levels, and effects of climate change. Australia has been the Pacific Island countries. However, Australia lost some of its political clout during a period of political and economic sanctions imposed on the military regime in Fiji. China stepped in to fill the vacuum and helped establish the Pacific Island Development Forum, a rival to the Pacific Island Forum in 2013. China is the second largest aid donor, and it is increasing its aid footprint in the Pacific. China's assistance comes in the form of infrastructure projects and is given to countries that adhere to the One China policy. 80% of China's aid is in concessional loans. China sourced materials for infrastructure projects and has a policy of migrating Chinese project workers to the Pacific Island countries. The IMF and other donor institutions have raised concerns on the sustainability of Chinese projects and the growing level of debt burden to China. Chinese loans can be an attractive alternative source of funding for many Pacific Island countries, as they do not come with the political conditions such as good governance that traditional donors often attach. These loans have also been seen as providing leverage for China to build up political and military influence in the Pacific in competition with the US, a claim that Beijing denies. The strategic aims of China in the South Pacific seem to be to ensure adherence to its One China policy, increase its influence in these countries since they exercise their votes in the UN and other bodies, and gaining access to Pacific ports for its fishing fleets and mining. In recent years, there have been periodic reports about potential Chinese naval base in Vanuatu or Fiji. In March this year, a draft security agreement between the Solomon Islands and China was leaked. Under the agreement, China could send armed police and military forces if requested by the Solomon Islands government. China could also station its Navy ships off the coast of Solomon Islands. The agreement is significant because the Solomon Islands is a transit point for cargo that moves in the South Pacific. It is important for the navigation of sea vessels and aircraft. The geostrategic significance of these islands scattered across the Pacific Ocean owes it to supply lines and for force projection. The US maintains a strong investment and intelligence presence in Australia and New Zealand and has a strong military presence in the Marshall Islands. The US has unequivocally expressed its opposition to the agreement. The State Department spokesman, Ned Price, said on April 18th, "We believe that the signing of such an agreement would increase destabilization within the Solomon Islands and will set a concerning precedent for the wider Pacific Island region." The Solomon Islands, Fiji, and the Pacific Island countries have become more assertive in recent years. There is a trend towards greater cooperation among Pacific Island countries within the framework of the PIF and other Pacific institutions. South Pacific leaders welcome Chinese aid and investment as it helps them with infrastructure projects they want or need. The perception that external powers are competing for regional influence has opened up global opportunities for South Pacific states. It has encouraged the belief that they can play competing powers with each other. But it also poses the risk of political dependence and unsustainable debt. It might enable China to extort significant political leverage, especially on international issues affecting China's core national interests. The situation on islands is reflective of the ongoing global and regional redistribution of geopolitical power. The winner of the game is not yet clear, but the scales may be gradually tipping in favor of an assertive China. From a wider geopolitical perspective, China may have been motivated by its desire to ensure maximum adherence to the One China policy, but it may be a reaction to the new Indo-Pacific institutions and the AUKUS Pact. The conclusion of the Defense and Security Pact between China and the Solomon Islands carries consequences for the neighborhood. First, if China were to establish a military base in the Solomons, Australia would be forced to move away from its Indo-Pacific focus and reorient its energies to security threats from its South Pacific neighborhood. The second risk is through elite capture and corruption and by undermining institutions of governance. In this way, one or more Pacific Island nations may be pushed into the scenario of a failed state. Most Pacific Island nations welcome the increased attention they are getting from Australia and its alliance partners. However, they also welcome China's presence. They do not want to be passive recipients of strategic designs of the West, but wish to be active participants in regional security networks. The Pacific Islands have become vocal advocates for strong global actions on climate change. This puts them at odds with the United States and Australia. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi made a whirlwind tour of the Pacific Island countries in May. During these visits, a number of bilateral economic agreements were signed, and Wang Yi proposed the China-Pacific Islands Common Development Vision and the 5-year Action Plan 2022-26, which could potentially undermine other regional initiatives such as the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. However, the big prize, a comprehensive security treaty, proved elusive. What the rejection of the deal by the Pacific Islands leaders showed was an unequivocal display of not wanting to be used as pawns in a geopolitical contest. As the Prime Minister of Fiji, Frank Bainimarama, observed, geopolitical point scoring means less than little to anyone whose community is slipping beneath the rising seas. Since 2000, China has regularly supported the Fijian military with vehicles, uniform, and personnel training. The total value of Chinese military aid to Fiji is likely to be in excess of US dollars 5.9 million. Similarly, China has delivered about 2.6 million worth of military aid to Tonga over the past 20 years. While this is going on, China is apparently seeking to normalize its military presence in the region through growing non-military activities by the PLA, such as disaster response and humanitarian aid. Is China emerging as a military power in the Pacific? Although China evidently has ambitions to expand its military reach in the Pacific, it would be premature to call it a regional military power. China's military aid to Pacific Island countries has diversified in recent years, but remains trivial in both volume and substance, primarily comprising non-lethal support and vehicles with low value. However, Chinese military presence in the Solomon Islands would be a geopolitical game changer. So far, the mounting economic and political influence Beijing has gained through development aid, infrastructure, loans, and trade poses a bigger challenge to the geopolitical status quo in the Pacific than its military activities. Thank you. Now I'd request Ambassador Yugendra Kumar to give his remarks.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, I wish to thank the ICS, a veritable thought leader in strategic discourse in India and about India overseas, and my good friend Ambassador Kant for this privilege. A truly distinguished panel, all of whom are domain experts in today's in the topic of today's webinar. So to contextualize the topic, we need to remind ourselves that we're living in a post-COVID and post-Ukraine world. Certainly, neither COVID nor the Ukraine conflict have ended and are on a meandering, uncharted course, but the onset has triggered geopolitical trends enveloping all parts of the globe, including the South Pacific. Hence, the topic includes the word emerging, even as we all know that the strategic contestation in the South Pacific has always existed during the interwar years, the Cold War years, and the post-Cold War years, and verily constitutes the scaffolding of the regional power equilibrium with all its global ramifications. A related aspect is as to what India's stakes are in the emerging strategic contestation and as to how its outcome would affect our national interest. A no less important aspect is to pay attention to the shifting sands on which the scaffolding of regional power equilibrium rests. This aspect also helps in understanding how these trends complete the emerging but fluid strategic scenario in the South Pacific. As regards the geopolitical and geoeconomic context, the 14 sovereign nations in South Pacific are population-wise quite small, roughly around 13 million, but span over 15% of the world's surface, making the vast oceanic countries. It is the world's most aid-dependent region, having amongst the highest population growth rates. Mostly under-resourced, only Fiji, Papua New Guinea, and Tonga have standing armies, characterized by political and economic fragility and geographical remoteness. Mostly single commodity and service economies, despite having very large exclusive economic zones disproportionate to the land mass and population size, they are vulnerable to frequent internal and external shocks from multiple sources. The geographical location of South Pacific island countries, complemented by the kindred island countries just north of equator, is on the strategic supply routes for the great powers, which saw major military and naval engagement during the Second World War, ranging from Guadalcanal in Solomon Islands to Kwajalein and elsewhere. From the strategic point of view, the outer Kiribati atolls are only 2,000 kilometers from Hawaii, and 6 kilometers separate Australia from Papua New Guinea. Kiribati, apart from its vast expanse, can also offer base for the Chinese commercial fishing fleet, as one reads about in the papers, no matter that the island group might cease to exist in 10 years thanks to climate change. The Marshall Islands host US advanced research facilities for anti-missile defense tests, and further northwest across the equator, the US military base in Guam, which is undergoing major expansion. Indeed, the US strategist George Kennan, envisaging the US dominated post-Second World War global order, had posited US occupation of strategic islands for power projection and control over navigation choke points, instead of getting involved in military alliances with other countries, necessitating manipulation of their domestic politics. With the US military backstopping, the key actors in the vast ocean region have been Australia, Japan, and New Zealand, as the former colonial powers such as the UK have receded, but are now reappearing, and France maintaining a token presence. Even the current stakeholder countries did not pay the requisite attention, thus contributing to economic and political fragility in these countries and to the internal turmoil. The rise of China led to rekindling of historic links with the regional diaspora, as also a checkbook diplomacy contestation with Taiwan. Since 2006, China has significantly scaled up trade, aid, diplomacy, and commercial activity, commensurate with this growing global strategic heft. China imports lumber, raw material, oil and gas, and fish, and exports a large number of consumer products. By 2018, it emerged among top 3 trade partners, and excluding Papua New Guinea, its trade had overtaken Australia's. After Australia and New Zealand, which contribute about 52% together, its aid, including concessional finance, is 8% total Pacific aid, at the same level as the US. Since 2019, only 4 among the Pacific countries recognize Taiwan after switching of sides by Kiribati and the Solomon Islands. The Chinese President Xi has visited Fiji in 2014 and Papua New Guinea 2018. All these countries are signed up to the BRI. In addition to individual Chinese business activities, Chinese state-owned enterprises are dominant players in construction activities worth about 958 million US dollars throughout the region. The Chinese strategic interests are manifold, and that's my take on it. Involving ever-increasing number of countries into the BRI activity network is one way of closer integration to a dominant economy. As its sequential strategic moves indicate, developing security cooperation with select countries is one way to get around the third island chain, centered on Hawaii, beyond the second island chain centered on Guam, through building capacities, better domain awareness, and strategic intelligence, keeping in mind the US strategic assets and increased hydrological activities. This is evident in China's geophysical and geological surveys, space tracking vessels, and Chinese attributed media reports about sensors for tracking the US submarines. China is also signatory to the Arctic Treaty and has research stations there. One possible reason for the stalemate in establishing marine protected areas there is a growing interest of China in the Arctic krill. Chinese distant fishing fleets, although they are not the only ones, are also reported to be engaged in IUU fishing, contributing to unsustainability of the Pacific fish stock. So among the recent developments, the contestation has intensified during the Trump period. It has also meant that the Pacific nations feel that they can benefit, as was pointed out by the chair, that they can benefit from this contestation in their political and economic security. There's also the greater engagement, as I mentioned, of Australia and other countries. Vanuatu has denied in 2018 that China funded Luganville Wharf, the largest in South Pacific, is being revamped under any debt swap agreement. US and Australia are now restoring at the cost of about $175 million, a defunct naval base in Manus Island in Papua New Guinea, 2019, basically to keep China out. There appears to be greater Chinese interest in Kiribati and Solomon Islands in 2019. As evident in the Chinese naval port visits, provision for training, donations of military vehicles and supplies to Fiji, Papua New Guinea, Tonga, and Vanuatu, representing the Melanesian and Polynesian countries, except those associated with the US, Australia, and others, are open to security cooperation with China. Military security assistance from China is only in the form of grant. That's to be kept in mind. The China factor has also loomed large in the independent referendum for Chuuk in Federated States of Micronesia, Bougainville in Papua New Guinea, and New Caledonia in France, and also in the Solomon Island decision for diplomatic switch in 2019. It is worth noting that most of these countries have been experiencing serious internal military conflict and political meltdown. Besides the US military base in the Marshall Islands and the Federated States of Micronesia, 2021, Australia, New Zealand, and the UK maintain no naval bases in these territories, whereas France has a token presence, I mentioned. US interest has also been increasing as manifest, for example, in the first ever hosting of the leaders of Palau, Micronesia, and the Marshall Islands in the White House by Donald Trump in May 2019. The previous Australian Prime Minister visited the region far more frequently in 2019 than any of his predecessors. The Chinese economic cooperation pattern being no different in this region, as we have seen in other places. There is also some pushback from various Pacific countries as the Chinese loans are maturing, with the Vanuatu being the only country to have accepted a new loan since 2018 for the extension of its Pekoa airport near Luganville. Chinese are resisting their demands for grants instead of loans. Australia successfully pushed back on Huawei-funded submarine cable to the Solomon Islands and bested China with its massive quadrilateral electrification project in Papua New Guinea at the APEC 2018 summit. So post-COVID and post-Ukraine developments, one could actually say that the Pacific nations' expectations are higher now, along with the realization that their bargaining leverage must not get blunted. The pandemic has led to considerable contraction of their tourism and fuel import dependent economies. During this period, Australia and New Zealand provided greater medical aid than China, and the social and economic linkages of these countries, especially tourism, are far stronger with Australia and New Zealand than they are with China. The intensifying strategic contestation is exemplified most recently, May 2022, in the almost simultaneous visit of the Australian Foreign Minister, when the Chinese Foreign Minister was also in the region. Chinese Foreign Minister had his second China-Pacific Foreign Ministers meeting, as well as bilateral visits. As in other regions, this second Foreign Ministers meeting can be seen to weaken the Pacific Island Forum, which in any case is not as strong as ASEAN. Chinese Foreign Ministers' common development vision, covering the various things which I mentioned already, and the 5-year action plan were not accepted by the Pacific Foreign Ministers due to apprehensions of split in the Pacific Island Forum platform. The President of Federated States of Micronesia, which has diplomatic relations with China, opposed this plan in a leaked letter to other Pacific leaders, warning of a new Cold War at best and a world war at worst. Although he agreed to a US base in his country, he also invited Chinese to make a transshipment hub for its BRI and MSR projects. Fiji, the co-host of the second China-Pacific Foreign Ministers meeting in a hybrid format, has signed on to BRI in 2018, but it's also the first Pacific country to sign on to the US-initiated Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, and such examples can be multiplied. The bilateral security agreement between China and Solomon Islands, the most recent example of the Chinese efforts at developing security ties with the Pacific Island countries. A country with a long history of political instability, with a collapsed economy, any social order maintenance operation can be confoundingly difficult enterprise, not sustainable in the long run due to expected internal and external pressures on China. Apart from the Australian and New Zealand effort to strengthening their ties, US has also become proactive with a significant military dimension. Most recently, on 12 July 2022, the US Vice President addressed the PIF Forum, assuring the Pacific leaders about strengthening US presence in the region across the entire spectrum of government activity. These include an envoy to PIF, embassies in Tonga and Kiribati, funding assistance at the annual rate of $60 million for the next 10 years, a multinational partners in Blue Pacific initiative, etc., etc. The other major US initiatives covering the region are Quad, IPEF, and the PIF summit level interactions. A major regional ongoing defense activity, in addition to the bilateral security engagements, is a RIMPAC cycle of exercises and the Western Pacific Naval Symposium under the direction of the US Indo-Pacific Command. Australia also carries out its regular Kakadu naval exercises. So what is the broad assessment? The coronavirus pandemic has impacted the region critically, further diminishing the already strained regional and national institutional capacities. The economic crisis is worsening state fragility through widening of internal fissures, and climate change and frequent natural disasters are demanding even greater resources, which are further weighed down by the public health crisis. This in addition to the other challenges like illegal migration, transnational crime, etc. At the national level, the leaders see an opportunity for better bargaining with the rival suitors, but the domestic turmoil may impose different choices on them. As recent trends indicate, China's own domestic compulsions may constrain their own choices, not only in terms of development aid, but also in the sustainability of the long-term security commitment. The imperatives of power projection over a vast oceanic geography.
Ambassador,
Yeah,
your time is.
yeah, I'll just finish another 1 minute. Will be constrained in the context of rising tensions in the waters closer to home. Certainly, the deepening geopolitical distrust in the wake of Ukraine conflict, encapsulated in the pitting of a non-nuclear country against a nuclear one, is yet another factor in the security considerations of these leaders. In his above cited letter, the president of Micronesia quotes the Chinese consul in Osaka as saying that the biggest lesson of this conflict is that the weak country must obey a strong country. And the obverse side, of course, is the sustainability of US interests in maintaining this and to lead in this kind of escalating action-reaction cycle. So basically, just to sum up, I would say that these are the kind of problems they're facing, and a more sustained engagement of fostering economic stability through diversification of social and economic and regional equity for regional countries possessing vast ocean resources that poorly husbanded is critical for the regional stability. An unstable region, fragmenting countries, no one's interest, including India's, and I mentioned all of these things at some detail. And I've also mentioned that the climate change, of course, remains for them a much bigger crisis. And very briefly, just one comment, half a second, about India's approach is basically much more development oriented. And that is something, apart from the fact that we are members of Quad and Malabar exercises take place in the vicinity of Guam and WPNS and so on and so forth. But our cooperation is more development oriented. And I feel that is really the best way in which stability can be fostered, which is actually a better way to manage, let us say, the kind of challenges which these people face, because the escalating military kind of a
Ambassador, I have to request
yeah.
you now to stop because we have spoken for 15 minutes.
Okay, I'll just complete my sentence. That this military escalation is not going to do any good to anyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. May I request Admiral Chopra to please give his remarks.
Thank you, Chair. I hope everyone can hear me. If you can't, please raise a hand. Delighted to be here, and thanks to ICS. What we're talking about is clearly a maritime theater. So I'm going to only talk about it from the maritime dynamics angle, principally from maritime security. Having said that, I think this entire affair of the South Pacific in 2022 is a storm in a teacup. It's a perfection of the Chinese narrative. Wang Yi visits 10 countries, and everybody thinks that the strategic dimensions have changed. Nothing much has happened in the South Pacific, which has not happened over the last 5-6 years. And in my personal opinion, it's much ado about nothing. Having said that, the South Pacific is important to any contestation in the Pacific, as World War II clearly shows us. And Japan then and China now realized that if you want to challenge the United States, you will have to challenge it in the Pacific eventually. And towards that end, as part of the Chinese dream, they need to look at the South Pacific as a possible springboard for challenge. They have been trying to gain influence there over the last 2 decades, primarily first to swing people away from Taiwan to themselves, and now through their normal strategy of aid and trade and the rest of it. Unfortunately for China, and I think it's pretty evident right now, that this strategy of theirs has been somewhat seen through, and Sri Lanka has sort of underlined it even more to the smaller countries, whether in the Indian Ocean or the Pacific. Now, these countries, as everyone has said, are small, are remote. They may have small populations, but they're overpopulated for their size, and they're in need of great assistance, which was forthcoming in bits and pieces from Australia, New Zealand, and the West, ex-colonial powers, in a fashion which they themselves have described as benign neglect. So clearly it was ripe for China to make a move and create some confusion in the area, and they did it by the foreign minister's visit, signing of a security pact with the Solomons. It helps to divert attention from things which are more important to China, and I think it has succeeded in that, as this particular webinar is indicative that most people are now trying to analyze Chinese aid. Anyway, where is China today? It has formed its citadel in the South China Sea and the West Pacific. The anti-area denial, anti-access strategy in that area of the ocean has worked. And China is clearly looking for launch platforms outside the 2 island chains, first and second, which this audience should be more than familiar with. Now, it's difficult from the security of the South China Sea to launch yourself into the Indian Ocean or the Pacific. It's very easy in peacetime, very difficult in wartime. China realizes this as much as anybody else and is looking for bases. Now, it doesn't have. The only base, as I've said previously in many places, that China really has outside its own country is in Karachi, where there are facilities set up to repair and service warships and submarines of the time that China uses. All the rest of the string of pearls are places where they get R&R, food, water, and everything else, and create a big splash, a big narrative, but from the maritime security point of view, very little else. Now, military base in the South Pacific would, of course, be ideal for China. But is it possible? Again, unlikely. Just like Djibouti is not a base by definition because of its insecurity, anything the Chinese put up in these islands would be insecure and difficult to sustain from the mainland. But it can keep everybody riled up and a little excited. So towards that purpose, it always helps. And I think they will continue to try for facilities. And I'm not going into the police setup and internal security, but they will show the flag here. They will come and anchor offshore. They will try and use some of the jetties for dual use, as has been the case in some of the areas, and will generally put up a challenge in terms of influence and heft, as someone did say, rather than in any military fashion. That influence and heft, as many of the diplomats here would realize, is very important, not just for the two words themselves, but for agenda setting, rules of engagement, standard setting, making the rules and everything else. And to that end, China would like to muck around in this area and be as influential as possible in all the various international, bilateral, and multilateral agreements that would come into play. Now, I don't want to get into too much of the geopolitical thing beyond like elite capture and other businesses, but let me just tell you from the maritime aspects that these islands are very, very useful for force projection, for slot monitoring, and for maritime domain awareness as a whole. Even in today's space-based satellite world, satellites can't give you a sense of what is happening on the ground, as well as listening stations and posts in the general area of operations. And to that end, I think China will try and use its trade concessions, aid concessions, and others to get some facilities which would help in establishing some of these monitoring bases. For example, Japan's entire coal from Australia comes through slots which pass through Melanesia and not so much Polynesia, but certainly through the islands closer to Papua New Guinea and the second island chain. What do you think, as you saw, and I'm just speaking extempore, as you saw, the nations are not foolish. They didn't fall for the greater vision as enumerated by China, and they are aware that any sort of military facility will immediately make this an area of contestation, which would not be in their interest. They are, as the chair said, and as Ambassador Yogendra Kumar also said, they're just utilizing this to play one against the other and extract as much from both. Now, the Western response, especially after UK, now when I say West, it includes Japan, Korea, and everybody else, Australia in the region, they're far from the West, has been pretty resolute. And I think you're seeing a series of steps now, I think they have learned from the South China Sea and Obama's blunders, and nothing happened for 5 years. And the Chinese changed the geography in the South China Sea. I don't think that they're going to let that happen again easily, whether it's AUKUS, whether it's freely associated states, which the US is again redealing with, or even when it is this newly formed partners in the Blue Pacific, 5 countries, Japan, US, UK, Australia, New Zealand, in June this year. So it's not just AUKUS and the military aspects of it, but there are diplomatic and other initiatives which are giving signals to China and to the island nations that it's a whole new ballgame than what it was in the South China Sea 5 or 6 years ago. So, as you saw, a little bit of concern that was voiced publicly in the Western media and elsewhere has seen the Solomon Island Prime Minister clarify his position and saying there's no question of a Chinese military base in the Solomon Islands. And Fiji, in fact, has signed up for the IPEF, the Economic Framework, and there are various FAS states, Palau are clearly negotiating again with the United States. Sri Lanka has been, I think, is a major setback for Chinese efforts with island nations, smaller nations everywhere. So, what do I want to say in sum? That the military base, the excitement of China's military navy pushing into the Pacific is completely off the mark. There is unlikely to be a military base in this region. China will continue to try and influence, will succeed a bit, will fail a bit. The West will respond, but the chessboard will remain pretty much the same. And that's what I think. I think also as we go along, the China story or the narrative or the dream, call it what you will, is suspect, and it's showing signs of brittleness, as all totalitarian states do. And what the future holds for China in itself is a different question altogether. Moreover, China can't afford to lose any more money. It's lost substantial money, $50 billion in Venezuela. I don't know how much in Sri Lanka. They can't keep pumping into countries and then the countries become failed states and collapse and the whole money just vanishes. So I am not unduly alarmed at all about the Chinese grand voyage of the foreign minister to these islands earlier this year. And as far as India is concerned, I don't think we have any real interest. Just observe and watch and continue our interaction with these nations as best we can. It is certainly not a priority area for India. And I think the useful thing that has happened with this particular developments in the recent past in this area is that Indian think tanks, Indian commentators, the strategic community will look at this area, will digest it, chew it, and realize that there's little to be done except watch it. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Admiral Chopra. May I now request Dr. Pragya Pandey to make her presentation. Can you hear me? I can't hear you. Can you hear me now?
Ma'am, could you try unmuting yourself?
Now it's working. So there was some change in the setting where I could not, unmute myself from the host side. Anyway, so thank you, sir, for that, introduction, and thank you to the ICS first of all, especially Ambassador Kantha, for giving me this opportunity to participate in this webinar today with such eminent experts on the panel. So a lot has already been covered by the two previous very senior speakers. So I'll try and basically focus in my presentation on the recent developments that have taken place in the region in the light of China's push in the region, and also touch upon analyzing the trends in engagement of other major regional players with the Pacific Island countries. So the South Pacific sub-region that we are talking of here about is basically kind of a sub-region of the Indo-Pacific region, which kind of serves as the strategic front line between Asia and Americas, and it consists of three major groups of islands, which are Melanesia, Micronesia, and Polynesia. So the region is basically consists of Pacific Island countries, which are small islands scattered over the Southwest Pacific Ocean. And these island countries are certainly not a heterogeneous group of countries. They have diversity in terms of their ethnic groupings, in terms of culture, language, their economic development, and also the political systems that they have. In the current century, we must acknowledge that one of the most significant shifts that the international international relations has witnessed is the shift in economic and political center of gravity from the Euro-Atlantic to the Indo-Pacific region. And that is the increasing salience of the Indo-Pacific construct in the recent years in the regional and global discourse has sort of brought attention to the South Pacific region as well in the recent times. And the Pacific Island countries, which are basically located at the crossroads of very strategically significant maritime trade routes and with relatively lesser economic development and significantly large and very resource-rich exclusive economic zones. And these are the countries which are recently have been attracting greater attention from the regional and extra-regional players. As we speak today, the regional and global environment is very highly charged with the strategic competitions and contestations among the major powers. We have the crisis in Ukraine, the US-China contestations is also visible in the South Pacific region as well. The region specifically has also been witnessing rising tension between China and Australia, which has been more, I can say, more visible during the pandemic, since the pandemic. And of course, there is China's asymmetric rise and its increasing foothold and assertiveness across the region. So all of this is contributing to the current geopolitical, emerging geopolitical contestations which are sweeping up in the region. The region has been undergoing many important development of late, and by far the most effective and disruptive engagement in the region in recent years has come from China. Until recently, it was one can say that region had not witnessed much activity in terms of major power competition in the recent years, and it was more of an area of US influence, which was managed under the trilateral military alliance between Australia, New Zealand, and United States of 1951 agreement. So China's profile in the region recently has been rising, given the significance of Pacific Island countries in the light of China's BRI projects and its increasing Chinese aid and assistance to the small island countries. Many of the countries, including Fiji, Papua New Guinea, New Solomon Islands, have signed the MOUs on BRI with China. And what is important to note that in the Pacific Island countries, the aid narrative has mainly sort of determined their relationship with the larger countries. So with the China emerging as one of the largest, highest donors and being the emerging as the biggest bilateral lender in the region, which is sort of challenging Australia's dominant position. So that is changing the nature of relationship between the Pacific Island countries and the major players in the region. So China, many of the countries in the region already have a huge amount of outstanding external debt to China, especially Papua New Guinea, there's Tonga and Vanuatu have around 60 to 70% of their total outstanding external debt that they owe is to China. So the things are changing with increasing interest and increasing, you can say, economic assistance that is coming from China to the island countries. And number of projects have been undertaken, and the BRI, there is this multi-purpose port that China has built and financed in Papua New Guinea, in the Manus Island. There is submarine cable project. There is the raft redevelopment that China has financed in Vanuatu. So these are there are other number of such projects which have sort of created anxiety among the Australia and New Zealand, the regional players, about possible strong foothold of China in the coming years as with these kind of projects under the BRI. So China, earlier there was this situation where Australia was quick to sort of replace Chinese giant Huawei for the construction of around 4,000 kilometers long undersea telecommunication cable in Papua New Guinea and Solomon Island. Another major important development, which is very important to note, is Kiribati and Solomon Island recently shifting their diplomatic ties from Taiwan to China, and the heads of state of both the countries also visited Beijing, and they sort of expressed willingness to support more Chinese investment, to attract more Chinese investment in their countries. So this now 10 of the 14 Pacific Island countries recognize have ties with China now. So Kiribati is also the same country which has recently withdrawn from the Pacific Island Forum, and just before the Forum Summit was to be held, Kiribati announced its intention to withdraw from the forum and did not participate in the Pacific Island Forum, which is important to note because Pacific Island Forum is the only sort of major regional platform which sort of bring these countries together to discuss issues of common concerns and challenges. So, and apart from that, Solomon Islands Prime Minister, while defending his position of shifting the country's ties from Taiwan to China, he said that China is an economic powerhouse and it provides an opportunity for the island to engage and address their developmental needs and challenges. Followed by this shift in Solomon Islands ties to China, the recent signing of deal, the Framework Agreement for Security Cooperation in April this year has been the most critical development that has sort of triggered the tension among the traditional regional players about possible militarization of region and China's continuous military presence in the region. US has outrightly criticized the deal, saying that it is a serious risk to the free and open Indo-Pacific. Both the prime ministers of Australia and New Zealand, while they were on visit to the Fiji for the Forum Summit recently, they have expressed concern about militarization of the region in the light of the deal. So the deal also marks Beijing's first bilateral security agreement in the Pacific. For China, the primary driver behind the agreement seems to be its long-term strategy of being the predominant power in the region, because the Solomon Islands also provides a very prime location from where one can exert and control over the surrounding ocean and airspace. So the strategic location of Solomon Island is very, very important from China's perspective. The deal has been criticized by the regional countries as having the possibility of undermining the stability in the region, because it entails that China can send its forces to protect the safety of Chinese personnel and major projects in Solomon Island. And it also mentioned that the Solomon Island may request China to send police and armed forces to maintain social order and protect lives and property. So, which essentially means that the possibility of presence of Chinese forces in Solomon Island under the agreement that has been signed. So, soon after the deal was signed, US immediately sent a delegation, high-level delegation, which was led by National Security Council Indo-Pacific Coordination, which went to the Solomon Islands, and the delegation expressed its concern about the purpose, scope, transparency, and the nature of the agreement. And they also expressed that any sort of attempt to militarize or sort of create any military installations in the region will have consequences for US and its allies. And in such case situation, US will respond accordingly. So that is what the delegation expressed while they were on a visit to Solomon Islands, and they also reiterated the US commitment to the region. Soon after the deal was announced, once again, the very significant visit of Chinese Foreign Minister, which has been mentioned by previous speakers, so I won't go into details of all that. So Chinese Foreign Minister also participated in China Pacific Island countries Foreign Ministers meeting, which is again important development to note. It is the second such meeting that was held, and there was also widespread report about China's intention to sign a region-wide agreement similar to the agreement that it has signed with the Solomon Island, with the 10 island countries, but that didn't really actualize. Australia has raised concerns about any permanent military presence close to its borders, and Australian Prime Minister held talks with the Solomon Island Prime Minister on the sidelines of the PIF summit recently, where he expressed concerns about possible military base in future, and expressed that it won't be it will be of major concern to Australia if so happens in the future. Similarly, New Zealand Prime Minister also spoke on the similar lines. So both the countries have been vocal about, both Australia and New Zealand have been vocal about over the past few years about the China's strategic ambitions in their backyard and its checkbook diplomacy and various white elephant projects. And they have also come up with their own policies, their own initiatives for enhancing their role in the region. Australia has announced its Pacific Step-Up policy, which aims at enhancing its security, economic and diplomatic cooperation in the region. Australia also announced that it would establish 5 new diplomatic missions in the Pacific. So that would extend its presence to every Pacific Island Forum member. On the other hand, and all of this has to be seen in the light of deteriorating ties between Australia and China during the pandemic, as many on many flashpoints or sore points on the issue of 5G, on the issue of Australia's critique of China's interference in Australia's domestic politics, COVID-19, and subsequent trade war between the two countries. Coming to New Zealand, New Zealand has also announced its fresh approach called the Pacific Reset Policy in February 2018, which again focuses on building deeper and more mature partnerships with the PIC countries, as well as increasing its diplomatic presence in the region. On the other hand, the United States has certainly been concerned about China's increasing investment across the region and lack of transparency in its actions. In June 2018, US-China Economic Review Commission's report was titled as China's Engagement in the Pacific Island, Implications for the United States. So the report clearly outrightly highlighted that China's increasing investment and involvement in the Pacific Island region is driven by its broader diplomatic and strategic interest, that is to reduce Taiwan's international space and gaining access to raw materials and the natural resources. And this could pose challenges to a possible Chinese base in the region could pose challenges to US defense interest and that to of its allies and partners in the region. US has been taking the region as a whole, the Oceania region as a whole, much more seriously in the recent years, which is reflected in number of high-level visits, like the one by Secretary of State visit in February 2022 to Fiji. Anthony Blinken visited Fiji, which was the first visit in 36 years to
12 minutes.
Sure. So just 2 minutes more. And it was the first high-level visit to Fiji in 36 years. Again, recently speaking at the Pacific Island Summit, Vice President Kamala Harris, and Pacific Island Summit has become an important platform because US has been attending these summits. Last year, President Biden, addressed the summit virtually, and this time Vice President Kamala Harris addressed the summit virtually once again. So where she announced a number of new initiatives, announced that US will be opening its embassies in Tonga and Kiribati. US also planned to reopen its embassy in Solomon Island, which was closed earlier on for a few years. US has been working on renewing its negotiation with the Compact of Free Association with the Marshall Island and Federated State of Micronesia and Palau. So overall, US has also been sort of trying to enhance its role in the region and trying to mend whatever diplomatic attention that the region has been lacking, so that they are trying to US has been trying to revise. So overall, one can say that to sum up, that geopolitical environment in the region has been certainly heating up in the recent years, with the traditional players, regional players, concerns about China's economic and diplomatic and strategic advances, and many of the PICs have been showing that they no longer seek exclusivity in their relationship with the major powers. And now it remains to be seen as we move forward how the Pacific Island countries in the South Pacific will navigate their relationship, their ties with the major powers in the region in the coming years. Thank you so much. And I'll take any questions or if there are in the question answer. Thank you.
Yeah, so now we come to the end of our presentation. I'd like to thank the speakers for their very informative and I'd like to invite questions from the floor. The participants might like to raise certain questions, and then our panelists can respond to them. So maybe I can, yes? Yes.
Sir, there's a question in the chat box from Mr. Debraj Ghoshal, who asks that what are India's economic interests in this region? And this is not directed to any particular speaker, so anyone could take it.
Maybe I can bake the rice.
Ambassador Yogendra Kumar, please.
Thank you. I think India's economic interests are certainly there. I mean, if you take South Pacific, of course, and include Australia, New Zealand, and all the rest of it, of course, then the answer, I mean, the question doesn't really need to be answered. But as regards the specific island countries, I think the fact, of course, is that these are small markets and not easy of access. And therefore, these it becomes a little difficult to actually, what should I say, develop a critical mass. But certainly there are many things which actually can be done and are being done. I can certainly say even with proper hand-holding, a lot of our small-scale businessmen, they can certainly be involved in a lot of things. And of course, you have the IT services, one good example. Then of course, I know from my personal experience, there are people who are into hospitality sector there. There, of course, there's scope for professionals to go and work in some of these places. And of course, in fact, my experience of Micronesia and Palau and these places actually is that most of these sectors are actually filled by Filipinos mostly. And of course, then in certain other cases, New Zealand and in Australia. But in the field of education, there's good scope. But certainly, I would say that food processing sector, governments, these are some of the areas which actually can be looked at. And of course, the government is looking into, I mean, the government actually has set up the Indo-Pacific Islands Development, what it is called, Sustainable Development Conference. So that is again, cooperation in a whole lot of areas, whether it is, let's say, agriculture, sanitation, energy, renewable energy, and all these kind of things, where actually, obviously, it's not that the government is doing all that. It'll actually be done with the help of the private sector. And of course, the government is like what they've done in Africa. Indo-Pacific network, for example, which is very good for tele-education and telemedicine. So there's a lot of scope. And I can, again, from personal experience, say that even as far as Marshall Islands, where actually I used to visit when I was in Manila, I mean, you find that Indian TV signals can be received and people actually are watching Indian television. They're watching the wrong kind of Indian television. Of course, some of these, what I would say are the marginal peripheral channels, not really, I would say, not really something which would be of wider community interest. But certainly, if there is a bit of a sustained effort on our part, then in these areas, we can do a lot because of the exposure increases. And of course, you have the Fijian Indians, and then a lot of other Indians are going there from Guam and from even, I remember some people from Mariana Islands being there. So there is a good amount of scope. I would say it is not a very, as I said, but it requires to be developed and sustained through with the help of the government association with the Pacific Island Forum and our own bilateral interaction. I think the scope is quite considerable. Thank you.
Dr. Pandey, would you like to say a few things on this?
Yeah, sir. So India's interest is largely, historically, if you look at it, it is mostly to do with presence of Indian diaspora, which is mentioned by Mr. Kumar as well. But if you look at in terms of areas of possible economic engagement, of course, one of the things is that I mentioned in my presentation also that these countries may be very small island countries, but they have a large exclusive economic zone. So therefore, they are very rich in sort of natural resources, hydrocarbons, etc. That is one area that sort of is driving, interest of other important, major players as well. And apart from that, e-network, I think traditional medicine, also traditional medicine in the area of agriculture, food processing. So these are the possible areas where, in terms of India's economic engagement, if you look at it, so these areas can be explored in future. And I think India has also recently sort of, because because their relationship is mostly dependent on the aid and assistance that comes from the major countries. So India's Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative, which India has announced since 2019. So I think India is open to engage with the like-minded partners in the region, and Australia has already has joined the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative. So there is, I mean, this is just an idea that, you know, India and Australia can do something together to sort of, provide some sort of assistance to the Pacific Island countries under the framework of IPOI, because IPOI covers wide range of areas from maritime security to resources to disaster management. And otherwise, India has, in the past also provided support when it came to HADR and, you know, disaster management in the island countries. In the past also, India has sent its assistance in those areas. So I think those areas can be explored in the possible sort of engagement with other regional players. Particularly, I'm talking about Australia here, which is because it is already sort of a part of IPOI initiative. So that is an area in future that can be worked on. That's my.
Admiral Chopra, would you like to add?
Yeah, I think we must get realistic about the maritime routes to this region. Hypothetically, Indians can trade and have an economic interest in every single country in the world. I mean, there's always space for investments and for markets. But trade to this, whether to or from, and this quantity of trade was not very attractive to either Indian importers or exporters, in the private sector at least, because of the way the shipping routes are constructed. I think I'll leave it there. And certainly what Pragya said about joint ventures with other countries, there is always a possibility to do that, especially in, as the chair mentioned, in high-tech areas. One could always look at that. But there is nothing specific about this region which makes it attractive to Indian business or Indian investment or Indian as markets for Indian products as compared to any other in the larger region. It's a challenge because of the way the shipping routes are there at the moment. That's what I'd like to say.
May I add just one or two other points? I think I know from, again, pharmaceuticals is again an area where there's a lot of interest in my time and certainly has grown. And of course, for any place, any region, wherever it is, I think the government has to actually develop the market, so to say. And therefore, the institutional hand-holding is required with the countries concerned. And also, and of course, now with the e-network, the tele-education and telemedicine, I mean, again, the scope is quite considerable. So I would say that, yes, of course, the market is very small and the distance being what it is, it's not very easy. But if we have any kind of interest in South Pacific, I think we should develop the business side of it. Otherwise, the interest would not be sustainable beyond the point. Thank you.
We have another question which I seem to have missed. How does one get back to?
Sir, are you referring to the questions by Yukti Pawar?
Yes, I think some question flashed on my.
So I could read them out if you want.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have a question from Ms. Yukti Pawar, who asks, do you think China is yet again going to use the strategy of debt trap politics in the region? Also, which of US, Australia, New Zealand, and Japan do you expect to be most proactive in trying to counter the Chinese influence? Sir, do you want to take multiple questions at once?
Yeah, we can do that. One is on debt trap policy, yes.
The other question is by Ms. Surbi Mutkil, who asks, if the speakers could elucidate on the relations of Australia with the South Pacific Islands vis-a-vis China, what is the scope of China overpowering Australian relations in the region? Then we have a question by Ambassador Kantha, who asks, you mentioned that the West has drawn its lessons from the expansion of the Chinese maritime presence in South China Sea. What are these lessons? How do you see the US-led West responding differently to Chinese activities in South Pacific compared to South China Sea? Yes, sir. That's what we have.
So let's start with the last question. What are the lessons the West drew from the events in the South? How is it what they're doing is different in what they're doing in the Pacific, the Chinese challenge in the Pacific, when they're dealing with this challenge? What are they doing different from their earlier experience? Ambassador Yogendra Kumar.
Right, thank you. Well, I think one lesson that I hope they've drawn really is that not neglect the area, because if this area actually is in a way the backyard and in a way the area where the logistics supply chains actually are laid out, in that case they cannot certainly ignore this area. And in fact, the condition which these Pacific Island countries find themselves today is, for me, for two reasons. One, of course, is that the legacy of the colonial administration, actually a mixed one. So the governance model could not quite develop the way as it ought to. That is the first point. The second thing is that they also developed the economies basically largely connected to their own economy, rather than to diversify the economy in such a way that they become somewhat self-sustaining to a certain extent. Because if these are agrarian economies or fishing community-based economies, in that case, the processing of local products, copra, for example, the shell or the coconut, for example, or so many other things, which actually could actually have become the base for them to make the economies more resilient, rather than make them all tourism centered. And then, of course, and because of the fact that they have a strategic component, so you pay much more attention to the strategic component rather than to the, as I said, more diversified and stable kind of economic and social economic growth. So because of which you have most of these states actually are untenable. They actually, if they're not failed state, they're actually practical collapse states. So actually the only lesson I can say they should, which they're not drawing, frankly, that's the point I want to make in my presentation, is that instead of talking too much about strategy and we are going to answer naval base by naval base and air base by air base, they actually should be concentrating for the larger, more stable socioeconomic growth, because if these countries are much more internally cohesive and much more socioeconomic resilient, they are a far better what should I say, defense against any kind of Chinese intervention. Chinese come there because these countries are bankrupt. So they say, okay, we'll give you this, and maybe you can allow our ships to dock and a whole lot of other things. So I hope that's the lesson they've drawn. And of course, South China Sea, of course, it happened because Obama's time, people thought America is tired, and therefore all this talk about the pivot to Asia and all that was seen as purely empty talk, by which time the Chinese had built the infrastructure and land reclamation and so on and so forth. So I hope they've drawn the right lessons, but maybe there's a role for India in this. Thank you.
Admiral Chopra, would you like to add? No? Dr. Pandey?
I will add. Can you hear me or not?
Yes, we can hear you, yes.
Okay. I mentioned this during my talk. I think South China Sea is now considered, with the response to the South China Sea by the United States in particular, is a textbook lesson now being taught in various places of how not to fall or for a bluff, as the Americans seem to have done under Obama during those crucial years from 28 to 2014 or 15. Certainly, the Obama administration's response or lack of it will play heavily in history. But during the time when the Chinese ignored all statutes of international law and went on to occupy and then militarize and then weaponize the islands without any reaction from other powers in the region, is basically that the fear of a flare-up as opposed to keeping it under control through a mixture of diplomacy and otherwise, won the day. But the net result is there for all to see. And I do not think that we will see a situation where the Chinese will now be able to occupy a certain atoll or an island without military reaction from a combination of other interests, including the West and local powers, including Australia and Japan. That is obviously open to question till it actually happens. But from what you can see, the South China Sea situation globally was very different in the post-Ukrainian situation now. And I don't think that there will be any endeavor to keep China appeased or keep China, off the hook, should it take any tangible actions in the South Pacific.
Dr. Pandey, would you like to add something?
Yes, sir. I totally agree with Admiral Chopra that, in case of South Pacific here, what we have seen recently is that very strong resistance from the regional countries, from the United States, of course, and from the Australia and New Zealand to the idea of possible militarization. So the response has come very early and in a very strong manner. And also how the China's proposed deal with the region-wise deal, similar to the Solomon Island deal, was rejected by the 10 countries which China sort of intended to sign during the Wang Yi's visit. So that also shows that there is certain kind of a regionally the countries are certainly more, you can say, to a certain extent united, maybe compared to how the ASEAN countries were on the issue of South China Sea. And so I see here the response is more the early and more, I can say, more aggressive in nature when it comes to China's attempt of increasing its presence in the region, its military presence in the region in future.
Well, I'd just like to add a couple of things, and that is the Chinese had made a legal claim to the South China Sea. It may not have any basis in international law, but they had a legal claim to those waters. And the timing, immediately after the global financial crisis, when the US was involved in also the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, US was inward looking. It had distractions, and it was not in a position to challenge Chinese aggressive assertions. So on the other hand, we find that the efforts of the Chinese to develop, to militarize the relations with countries in the Pacific islands, the Americans have given it high-level political attention, with Kurt Campbell, who is the coordinator for the Indo-Pacific as well as for the Pacific Islands, personally involved in this. It shows the level to which the White House attaches importance to the events in the Pacific and Chinese assertions. The next question is Australia's relations with the South Pacific. May I request Dr. Pandey to begin? Australia's relations with the South Pacific.
Awesome. So for Australia, it is the South Pacific, the Pacific Island countries. It's immediate neighborhood for the country. So obviously, it is an area of priority for Australia and Australian foreign policy. And recent, visit by the Australian Foreign Minister, that she was just has been appointed as the Australian Prime Minister, and the first visit that she takes is to the Fiji, and that kind of shows that in future also the area remains a priority area for Australia, and Australia is is, of course, being part of the UNGIS Treaty since 1951, so has been the most, you can say, New Zealand and Australia have been the important regional players. So China is a late entry, or you can say is entering the region now. And of course, it is, if you look at the geography, obviously Australia has much deeper, you can say, presence in the region. It has much deeper relations with these countries in terms of whether it is historical, it's just cultural or economic. So the relations are much more deeper. Australia is also part of the Pacific Island Forum, one of the leading members, and I think Australia's relationship with the island countries in the region is much more deeper, and it should not be compared with how China's relationship will be in coming years with Australia. I think because it is a major regional player, and along with the United States, Australia and United States and New Zealand have been the important, you can say, players in the region. So China is a recent entry, one can say, into the region. So it should not be compared with the Chinese relationship.
Ambassador Yugendra Kumar.
I'm sorry, I was having some problem with my earphone. Can you repeat the question, please?
Australia's relations with the South Pacific.
Okay, well, Australia's relations with South Pacific, of course, are historical. And they, in fact, in a way...
In the context of the Chinese inroads in the South Pacific, what would you say about Australia?
Well, I would say, of course, that China, of course, has been seen as a rival by Australia, because even under the existing arrangement under US hegemony, so to say, Australia actually was seen to be the local, what should I say, local defender of the strategic interests of the West in that area. So that role has always been there. But I think now the role is increasing, because before Herbert Morrison, the previous Australian prime ministers did not really travel much to that area, and of course now they're getting quite active. The other thing, of course, is from a security point of view, they've always been quite active, whether it's the Papua New Guinea or the Solomon Islands, for example, or of course the other islands in the vicinity. So they have been playing that role, and that role is going to increase certainly. And now, of course, you have various other initiatives being talked about now, which actually are being launched. So I think now the role is becoming more active. To what extent they would be in a position to actually meet the Chinese military challenge head on, that is something which one actually has to wait and watch. The Americans, of course, are through AUKUS, they're trying to actually project Australia into that role. But Australia still has a long way to develop its defense capabilities. I mean, the modernization program that they have been talking about, still, they have to work on that a lot more. So I would actually say that while they have the links, they have the connections, Australia and New Zealand, and therefore, to that extent, they're fully aware of what's happening in that area. But I think they need to prepare much better and be much more engaged in South Pacific and this area than they have been so far.
Admiral Chopra, specifically on the
Kelly, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. There is no repeating that. It's clearly Australia's immediate strategic neighborhood. If you cast your mind back, Australia has militarily intervened in this region on 7 different occasions in this last millennium, including in Vanuatu in 1988, I'm talking from post-Cold War, in Fiji in 1987, the Solomons in 2000, in Tonga in 2006. So it's not just talk. If their interests are threatened due to internal law and order situations or military coups or any other such situation, and certainly in Chinese intervention, they have acted in the past, and in my assessment, they will act in the future. And the last Morrison government changed the entire gameplay with China, as we are all aware. I think the present Labour government is going to follow that policy. And I don't think the Chinese in fact did some elite capturing in Australia itself. which hasn't gone down well with the public at large, irrespective of political affiliation. And I don't think the Chinese are now in a position to try and swing public opinion by capturing elites or politicians from India. So to that extent, I don't think there's going to be any hesitation on part of Australia and its partners to challenge any Chinese incursion or inclusion in any sort of this island. Again, most people don't know that Australia funds and looks after many projects like the Pacific Patrol Boat Initiative, which has been on since 1985. They've supplied over 30 boats to all these islands. Similarly, there is a maritime security project since 2009, which is funded. I'm sticking to the maritime angle, as I told you. And all these are ongoing, and they don't attract attention, as much attention as a sweeping tour by a Chinese foreign minister. But they are very much there and very much looked up to by these island states in the Pacific Forum. So, and as far as the Chinese threat for Australia is concerned, I think that's again overblown completely. Australia is well in a position to defend itself from any Chinese military action to Australia itself. So that
Australia, of course, yeah.
that would not be a consideration in intervention in this region by Australia. And as I told you now, they've just last month signed up a partnership for the Blue Island, the Blue Pacific, again with like-minded partners. And these are all statements of resolve, if nothing else. But resolve can only be tested when the chips are down, as we have seen in history. So there is great indication of resolve. In my view, they will back up that resolve. Some others may think not, but only time will tell. Thank you.
Yeah. And the prospects for potential debt trap diplomacy. Dr. Pandey, would you like to, debt trap?
Yes, sir. So, I mean, looking at the examples from elsewhere in the past, most importantly, the Hambantota port. Obviously, the fear is about the whole idea of, the white elephant projects and debt trap approach and possibility of these countries falling into China's debt trap. And I already mentioned that, a huge amount of their external debt already is to China. Many of the island countries already have a huge amount of debt to China. So there is a possibility of, debt trap in future for these regional countries. And that is the whole fear that we are talking about then under the BRI approach. And also the question mentions, the second part of the question is that of which US, Australia, New Zealand, and Japan do you think would be more proactive in trying to counter Chinese influence? I think here, without any doubt, I think US, Australia, and Japan have been more vocal. US, Australia, and New Zealand, sorry, have been, because they are the ones who are immediately, they are the ones who are going to face any sort of repercussions of Chinese military presence in the region, particularly Australia and New Zealand. So I think they will certainly be more proactive in terms of countering, if I can say, any Chinese military presence or military action in the future, if there is any. So I think certainly it is Australia, New Zealand under the, of course, the alliance with United States. So that is it.
Thank you. Ambassador Yogendra Kumar, would you like to?
Yes, thank you. Actually, my battery seems to be, for some reason, actually going down. So I will try to, as much as possible. If I get interrupted, then that will be the end of it. But, well, thank you. Actually, no, I think debt trap is a situation which certainly most of these Pacific Island countries find themselves in. And a large amount of that actually is owed to China, though not entirely. That, of course, is certainly the fact. But with the fact that these countries are pressing China to actually convert these soft loans into grants, and the Chinese are resisting that because I think they're afraid of similar voices being raised in other parts of the world. So that, in a way, is a bit of a check as far as China's influence paddling is concerned in this area. But in terms of the economic development, let's talk about the Pacific Blue economy and so on and so forth. The EU is quite committed on this. UK is coming back. France is also increasing its engagement. So I think in terms of all these programs, there is no dearth of it. It's just a question as to how they are to be coordinated in such a way as to make the maximum impact, and through that diminish the leverage that the Chinese might be having because of the fact that these countries owe a lot of money to China. Of course, if like for example, if they're talking about Solomon, in the case of Solomon Island, that the wharf that they're developing, that there's a debt swap agreement or anything like that. In that case, that would actually cause a major hassle. But as I said, I think that ultimately the question really that these countries are themselves economically in not such a good shape. I very much doubt if even some of these things which actually do appear, how long they can be sustained. In my view, for a simple reason that ultimately the Chinese PSU which are involved there, they also have to account for. In terms of balance their budget, the budget balance their own books, and also the fact is that these PSUs actually also are a little careful as to how much they want to get further involved into it. That's my larger point. Thank you.
From my perspective, let's just cut to the chase. Correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Pandey, but from what I know, that the island nations of the South Pacific have not taken any concessional loans from China after 2018.
That's correct. That's
clearly,
correct.
Clearly, the debt trap concern is not there, but it is to talk of debt traps anymore is superfluous because the island nations have seen the debt trap and are already not taking concessional loans, which form the basis of the debt trap.
Vanuatu has taken loan for this airfield renewal.
Yeah. They're more than aware. They're far more than aware. And they're watching the situation as well. So
they've taken this.
To worry about they've asked China, and from what I read about their interaction with China, that they are looking for aid in financial terms and not through loans, and aid without strings, which China may or may not be in a position to provide. As I did mention, in my opinion, China is running out of money. It's lost a lot of money in all these ventures. Thank you.
I'd like to add just a couple of sentences. The frequent interventions or the infrequent interventions of Australia in the Pacific Island countries for various reasons, and also the sanctions against Fiji. All these events have somewhat diminished the soft power of Australia in the Pacific. And the second thing is related to the type of aid which the Australians give. The Chinese give infrastructure aid, bricks and mortar aid. A lot of the Australian aid is involving sending experts for capacity building, whether it's related to governance, or related to policy, or it's related to training police officers in law enforcement. Whereas they don't get involved in creating hard infrastructure. So typically you go to any Pacific Island country, you will find the Prime Minister's house, the President's house, the Parliament will be made by Chinese companies and will be part of the assistance which the Chinese are giving to these countries. And finally, the danger from debt trap diplomacy is twofold. Either it can lead to state failure, or it can lead to the acquisition of strategic assets in settlement of the aid, as happened in Sri Lanka. And actually in Sri Lanka, both things happened. You had perhaps both things happened. You had the sort of, at least,
state failure.
of state failure, and you add also the handing over of Hambantota port to and the real estate, the special zone to the Chinese in settlement of a debt. So that can play itself in this area. And I, actually, frankly speaking, it's very difficult to predict whether that can entirely be prevented because water has flown under a lot of bridges. So coming back to the old question of whether we have learned the bigger lessons behind the geopolitics of the Pacific and the South China Sea or the Southeast Asia, I think this unchecked facilitation or creating an environment or assisting China to grow big economically has unleashed a great geopolitical influence that we are no longer able to limit or control because it's gone rogue. Is there any other question, or can we call it a day at 4:30?
Yeah, I think we can conclude.
Yeah, okay. Actually can be considered as my concluding remarks. There was an interesting question that came earlier also about what are the aims of India in the Pacific Islands. So I'd like to say that we share our development experience and develop and establish development partnerships with a lot of countries because Indian way of doing things, our technologies and our systems are perhaps more suitable for these countries also. And we have been helping these Pacific Island countries within our capacity and resources. This is very important because if India wishes to be a permanent member of the Security Council, then India must also have a global reach to her foreign policy and global goodwill. Looking at it from a very narrow perspective, these countries have 12 votes in the UN, as I mentioned earlier. And then if under the present government and previous governments, if the Indian community and the Indian communities in some Pacific Islands are a very important part of our foreign policy. We have seen the way the government of India has been coming to the assistance of Indian communities during crises and natural disasters, etc. So that is also a very, very important benefit to us and a very important objective for us in our foreign policy. Well, with these remarks, I really
Ambassador, since you said that, may I just respond with one before you close, since you said that, it has always been my concern that we spread ourselves too thin in this great attempt for votes from the global south. We do not have the state capacity or the funding to spread ourselves all over the world. And we are trying to do a China and go all over the place as a part of a great campaign for UN Security Council. It will not depend on these votes. My view is, and this is a contrarian, perhaps, that we just don't have the governmental capacity to deliver, nor the funding to spread it so thin, and now reach out for another area of the world in the South Pacific, which in our order of priority, if I may say, is not very high. I just had to say that since you mentioned the Global South and UN votes.
Well, I'd also like to thank Ambassador Ashok Kant for being present here at the seminar and for organizing it. I think all the participants have really enjoyed participating in this event. May I request him to make a couple of remarks before we close for the day?
Well, thank you, Biren. I just wanted to thank you and other panelists for an excellent seminar. This happens to be my last Wednesday seminar, actually, as director of ICS. So that makes it perhaps even more interesting. I would not like to give a farewell speech here, but just wanted to thank all the colleagues, and we'll continue working together.
Yeah. And whatever incarnation you choose, we wish you all the best.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pandey. Thank you,
Thank you,
Ambassador
sir.
Vijay Kumar.
Thank you.